Welcome back, everybody. We are waffle boxing with our drop-down menus that are working pretty awesome at this point. We have the single option enabled. We have the blur option enabled, and everything is looking pretty good at this point. So what we're going to be doing in this lesson is we are going to add some keyboard interaction to our drop-down menus. This is something you would normally expect to see from a high-quality drop-down component, is that for added accessibility and just for some added functionality for those users that prefer to use their keyboard in some scenarios, we're going to add a new listener, a keydown listener, to our toggle component that's going to optionally allow us to add some extra functionality to do things like escape out of the menu using the escape key, or using the arrows to navigate up and down through the menu itself. And this is easy enough to do with a few extra additions to our toggle component that we're going to enable on these drop-down interaction instances that we have created. So let's take a look at how we're going to do that. We're going to jump into Visual Studio Code, and we are going to go into our toggle.js, where in the previous lesson we added our blur click listener. And I'm going to go all the way to the top of this file because we're going to add a new option to our component configuration here that's going to allow us to enable or disable key control. And that's going to be false by default unless we specify that we actually want to use that when we're instantiating our dropdowns, which we do in fact want to do. So I'm going to add key control is true on our dropdowns. And now using this option on our instance of toggle, we can basically add a new keydown listener, just like we did way back in the very beginning of the whole series. We had that really simple example of a switch where we also used some button or space or something to also toggle the switch. We're gonna do the same thing here, except we're gonna really make this functionality specific to our toggle that we have created. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to come down to this initialize method where we are adding our listeners. We're going to add a new listener, global listener, just as always, to the document. But this time we're going to add a keydown listener. And this is going to take our keydown event and pass it to a new method that we're going to create on this class called this.keydown, like so. And now that we've added a new global listener, a global keydown listener, we're going to go ahead and create this method now, this keydown method. I'm going to go all the way to the bottom of our file. After our blur that we created a couple lessons ago, we will add a keydown, which will take an event, of course. And let's just add a JS doc thing up here so we can specify this as a keyboard, or is it keydown? I think it's keyboard event. Keydown event, like so. And let me just make sure that that is correct. We have e dot, I might have to finish key down listener up here. And let me just make sure e dot target. Yeah, so we get the autocomplete since we added the JS doc there because e, as you can see here, if we hover over that, it is a keyboard event. That's the type of variable. And that's why we did this weird JS doc thing up here, just to get some nice IntelliSense, just like we have in our click listeners up above. Okay, so what do we want to do in this keydown listener? Well, first of all, let's check and make sure that key control is enabled, because if you haven't enabled key control, let's just immediately return out of this event, this method, because we don't need to do anything. So we'll say key control not enabled. And if that's the case, if this.config.key control is falsy, we will simply return right off the bat. And that was easy. And just as a reminder, since it's been a while, I'm going to do console.log e.target. And let's go into one of our drop downs. And you'll notice here that whenever you click or you have a keydown event, e.target is always going to be what has the current keyboard focus. So if I hit tab, oh, you know what? It's not tabbing into the menu, I bet, because I didn't add an href to these links. So let's fix that. I want to be able to tab to these. If you don't have an href on a link, like you can see right here, all of these anchors just have a class equals. I'm going to do a select all instances of this. That is select all occurrences So Shift Command L. I might have changed that keyboard shortcut, so you might want to find that in your command palette. But anyway, so I'm selecting a whole bunch of instances. You'll see all these yellow lines over here. Actually, I'm changing that in a lot of areas where I didn't add an href. And I'm just going to come over here and do href equals just the number sign. So they don't actually go anywhere. But by adding an href, you'll see here, hopefully, if I hit enter and I hit tab, yeah, I can now tab down into the menu. If you don't have an href, you can't actually give it keyboard focus. So we'll need to make sure we add that. But you'll notice in the console.log over here, again, just as a reminder, e.target is always going to equal whatever has keyboard focus at any given time. So that blue outline, you'll sort of see on each one of those, every time I hit the key down, it's going to give me whatever had focus whenever I press the key down there. And that means in our toggle.js, we can, first of all, get closest, not closet, but get closest toggle container. And that's going to say const toggle container equals e.target.closest. This.config.toggle container. Like so. And the reason why I want to get the closest toggle container to e.target is because this is going to be an easy way to check, first of all, that this is actually a key down that we care about. Because if e.target doesn't have a closest toggle container, then we know this is not a method, not a key down that we actually care about. If we have focus on something else somewhere, it's not going to have a closest, dot toggle or dot dropdown or whatever that toggle container is. So we can simply say if toggle container is falsy, then let's simply return, because dot closest will actually return null if it can't find a closest ancestor element. And so that way, if we get to this point, then we know that we have a toggle container, and we can we verified that we're in a toggle. This is a key down that we actually care about. What we can do is we can now use the event key or event key code or whatever we want to kind of determine which key we want to actually use. So the first one we'll do, I think this one will be a little bit easier, is I want to make it so that when you press the escape key, you can actually, like if I were to press escape key right here, when the keyboard focus is on the drop-down menu, I would normally expect to be able to hit escape to escape out of a drop-down menu. I think that's something that's very common in a lot of drop-downs you use, is you hit the escape key. And this is the same thing like if I were to use my keyboard in the OS and I hit escape, that drop-down menu disappears. And that's the two things that we want to add. Just like what you see here in the OS or in the Chrome context menu, I right-click, I can use my up and down arrows on my keyboard to navigate through all these options, and I can hit escape to get out of that menu. I want to add that same functionality to our drop-down. So I want to hit up and down to move up and down to the options, and I want to hit escape to dismiss it. So we'll add the escape first. And in order to do that, let's open up that keycode.info site I mentioned. I'll post another link to this if you didn't already have it bookmarked in the video description down below. But you'll see if I hit the escape key on my keyboard, I can see event.key is going to equal escape with a capital E, like there. So we'll go ahead and use that as our method to determine that the escape key was pressed. So that's going to look like this. We'll do if e.key is equal to escape. And if that's the case, we'll go ahead and prevent default. I don't think escape does anything by default, but just in case, we'll go ahead and prevent the default because we are focused on something we care about in this case. We're going to override the default behavior. And we're going to basically, when you press escape, let's go get all the active toggles or the active drop downs in this case, and let's disable those. So that's going to be very similar to a blur up here. And I can actually just copy this right here because it's going to do the same thing. We're going to document.query selector all and then get all of those guys there. So let's go ahead and copy that. We'll paste it right here. And we can actually scope this just to the toggle container, because I only want to get the buttons within this particular toggle container. So this will be a little more performant. We don't have to search the whole document like we did in a blur. And we'll take each active button and we will active button.click because we know the button's active. And let me move this to a separate line so it's a little easier to read there. But again, we're going to the container that we found earlier. we're getting all of its active buttons, or the buttons where the aria expanded equals true, and we're gonna invoke a click. We're gonna dispatch a click event on that button. And let's add a comment here, dismiss on escape, like so. And then once we do that, you will notice if I hit enter to open that, I hit tab. If I hit the escape key, it's actually going to dismiss that menu. Just like that, we added some cool dismiss functionality. I can dismiss from the button itself, so I can hit escape there. I can also dismiss from these other drop downs up here. I can tab into it and hit escape, and it's going to dismiss that menu. So that was pretty easy, right? Adding the ability to escape. And I would normally make this a little more granular. Like right now, we just have like this.config.key control. I would normally make it a little more granular than that. So just for example, maybe we can also have an option that's, this.config.key escape. So maybe if you like want to have key control, but maybe you don't want to allow people to use the escape key, then maybe we'll check to make sure this is truthy first. And maybe that can be truthy by default. So key escape. But that's usually something I would do as well, is we can add key escape is true by default. So if you enable key control, it will allow you to escape by default. But if for some reason you want to disable this feature, you could through that key escape configuration option. And we're going to leave it as the default, so there's actually no difference. I can still hit escape here, and it's going to work just fine. But now we have the ability to disable that if need be. Cool. So that's a pretty simple key down. They're using the escape key. And what we want to do now is we want to add that second feature that I mentioned, which is whenever you are in a drop-down and you use the up and down keys, currently that is tied to scroll, right? But again, whenever you are in a drop-down menu and you use up and down, many users, especially for accessibility reasons, would expect to be able to use the up and down arrows to actually navigate options within the drop-down menu. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. I think normally what a lot of people reach for is traversal. So for example, when you're on a particular focusable, we'll call them focusables down here. So if I move my keyboard focus down here, you'll see here's my focus right now. My keyboard focus is on this anchor. So this menu item, this anchor with a class of menu item. And if I want to go to the next one, when I hit down, I could say, go to my parent LI and then go to this list items next sibling, next element sibling, and then go to its child and find that and then set the focus to that. You can do that in JavaScript using traversal. But again, kind of like we talked about when we added the toggle container option many lessons ago. I like the HTML structure to be as flexible as possible. I don't like to do traversal in a way that sort of forces me to have the HTML be in a certain structure, because maybe in the future I want to add a dropdown that doesn't use an unordered list. Maybe I want to use a div with anchors, or I want to use a div with buttons in it. And those buttons are each wrapped in their own div or span or something like that. And I want to have the flexibility to change that HTML structure on the fly. So what I actually want to do in this case is maybe we can add sort of a special thing here where we'll go out and we'll get all of the focusable elements inside of the .dropdown. So inside of the toggle container, we'll say, okay, let's go out and use a query selector to get all of the focusable things inside of this dropdown. Let's put them into like a node list or an array or whatever. And then we can basically, because it's kind of like an array, you can basically move back and forth in the array based on hitting the up and the down arrows. So I think that's going to be easier, and it's going to be a lot more flexible because it's going to allow us to keep our HTML nice and open and available to change if need be. So what that's going to look like is down here, what we'll do is we will navigate on arrow keys. And so we can create another option, this.config.key navigation, I guess. I don't know. Key navigation, and then either e.key is equal to, and let me go back here. So we have arrow up and arrow down. So those are my arrow keys on my keyboard. So either e.key equals arrow up, or e.key is equal to arrow down. So we're going to put both of these. I'm not going to do two separate sort of if statements for up and down, because I think they'll both work very similarly. And I think we can accomplish this in one if statement here. This actually should be an else if. Linter. Closing curly brace does not appear on the same line. Brace style. That's the linter doesn't like that. I'm getting the red squiggly. I'm just gonna, you don't have to do this, but I'm gonna go into, you could just move this here like this and that'll make that happy. But just for clarity and brevity, I think it's good to like kind of put the comment above this, even if I wouldn't do that normally in my own file. But let's just say that let's just disable this for now. So this is the brace style. So let me open ESLint RC and add brace style. And I'll change that to a warning so that it's yellow and it doesn't look quite as glaring there. So if you want to do that too, you can just add in your ESLint RC, add brace style :1 underneath rules here. And then that'll change that from an error to a warning. 2 is an error, which is the default, and 1 is a warning. And that way it'll allow us to bump this down a couple lines. Anyway, totally optional. I digress. That's just the linter thing, linter configuration. But so we've added this else if statement that's checking to see if we have this key navigation option. So we need to add that first of all. So let's go up here and we'll do key navigation is to be true by default. But again, I'm kind of adding this as an extra option so that we can optionally disable that if we instantiate a component and we want key control, but maybe we only want escape or we only want navigation on a particular control, then we can use these two options to kind of disable those as needed. And then so if key navigation is enabled and you either press the up key or the down key, then what we're going to do is, just like I mentioned, we're going to go and we're going to get all the focusable elements inside of this toggle container, and then we can kind of, using an array, we can navigate between those. And that's going to look like this. We will first of all say get focusables in container, and that is just going to be, I guess, a query selector all. So we'll say const focusables is equal to toggle container.query selector all. And then the only things that are going to allow us to have focus are going to be either buttons. I almost typed burritos. I'm thinking way back to the taco spinner from so long ago. Buttons and things with an href attribute, right? So those are going to be the only things that have it. And you might have to mess around with this, like in your application, if you have other things that have keyboard focus, like if you've added a div with a tab index or something, you might have to sort of whitelist that here. But in this case, not buttons, sorry, button. It's either going to be button elements or anchors, which will have this href element. And again, it's only going to be a focusable anchor if you actually have an href. So that's why it's usually a good idea to use an href attribute selector here. But that's going to get us all of our focusable elements. And then once we have that, we need to determine which one of these focusable elements has the current focus. So we can call that a focus index. So get current focus index, and we'll say let focus index is going to be 0 by default. But then we'll kind of just loop through using a for loop. We'll loop through all of our focusables until we find the one that has focus. And we know which one has focus because, again, e.target has keyboard focus currently. So we're basically just going to compare each of our focusables to e.target. And if we find one that matches, that's the same element, then we know as we loop through this, and as long as we have a counter, we know that's going to be our focus index, or a zero-based counter, where, if we're focused on the first item, it's going to be 0, the second item is going to be 1, etc. So let's say for let I equals 0, I is less than focusables.length, I++. So it's going to be a for loop. And if focusables of I is equal to e.target, that's our current focus. So if it's equal to e.target, then focus index is going to equal I, so whatever we've counted to. And we don't need to count any further at this point because we found our focus, so we'll go ahead and break out of that for loop. And at this point, let's just to see how this works, console.log focus index. So let me just show you how this works now. We're getting our focusables. If we hit the up and down key, it's going to log out our current focus index. So if I use the tab key to go into waffle GIFs and I hit tab and go to let's say the second item in here, and I hit down on my keyboard, you'll notice that it logged 2. And why did it log 2? Well, it went to this dropdown, which is right here. And that dropdown contains both the toggle button itself, which is this anchor, as well as all of these anchors down here. And so the reasons it's 2 is because waffle gifts, the toggle button is 0, send a wafflegram is 1, and waffle bouquets is 2. I'm realizing the silliness of these labels as I'm saying them out loud. I kind of haven't paid attention to them until now. But anyway, it's 2 because, again, it's a 0-based index. So we have 0, 1, 2. That's our current keyboard focus. If we tab to the first one and I hit up, you'll see it's going to log 0. If we tab to the last one and I hit up, it's going to log 4. So it's always going to, the focus index is now going to indicate which one of the focusables I'm actually focused on. And now we can actually navigate using the focus index by saying focusable navigation. So we'll say, we'll set a variable called next focus index. So based on whether you hit up, it's going to go previous, or if you hit down, it's going to go to the next one. So the next focus index is going to equal focus index, which is going to be whatever's returned from this little for loop right here, plus, and it's going to be we can use a ternary operator. So we can say e.key is equal to arrow up. And if that's the case, we'll actually subtract 1. Otherwise, we'll add 1. So again, I'm taking that focus index, whatever it is up here, and I'm going to create this variable called next focus index, which is going to equal whatever our current focus is, and it's going to add either -1, which is going to subtract 1 from the current focus index if we hit the up key, or in the other case, if we hit the down key, it's going to add 1 to that. And have an extra space here. My linter's yelling about, but that will console.log next focus index. You'll notice here, as long as our math is right, if I hit down, it's going to say, hey, the next focus index is 1 because you're currently focused on 0. So go and focus on the number 1. And if I hit tab all the way down here and I hit up, the next focus index is 4. Because if I hit up from falafel waffle, which is fun to say. Again, it's going to go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Up is obviously going to be chicken waffles in this case. So that seems like it's working good. So now that we have the next focus index, we can say focusables of next focus index dot focus. This isn't going to work completely. There will be a couple scenarios where that won't work, but you will see if I tab over to waffles and I hit the down key, it is actually navigating, even though we're still scrolling. So we probably want to make sure that we are e.prevent default inside of here. And then that way, let's tab here. And now when I hit up and down, it's not scrolling. That's great. I'm using the arrows on my keyboard. But if I hit down from falafel waffle, we're gonna get an error, right? Because we try to focus on the next focus index is out of range. So we need to make sure that if next focus index is greater than or equal to 0 and next focus index is less than focusables.length, I think. If those two conditions are true, then we can try to focus, because we need to either be like, if you're at the 0th item, the very first item, and you hit the up key, you're going to be trying to access the index of -1, which isn't going to exist. Or if there's like 6 items in the focusables node list, and you're on the very last one and you hit down, it's going to try to set the focus to something that is not in the array, because the array is not big enough. So hopefully this if statement now, if we clear the console and we tab to waffle gifts and I hit down, if I keep hitting down, I'm good. If I keep hitting up, I'm good. So just like that, we added some awesome arrow key navigation. Look at that. That's working pretty good. And that wasn't too painful for us to add either, at least I don't think. And again, this is one of many methods to do this. You could certainly go the traversal route if you know your drop-down HTML structure is never going to change, or if it's going to be really predictable. You could have all sorts of ways you could do this. But this one, I think, just works really well, because you just get all the focusables in an element. Again, it's going to work across a wide array of different types of toggles. So when you are, for example, in the future, when we want to build a modal dialog, we can very easily be able to use the escape key key to escape out of a modal dialog, even though we don't necessarily want to use keyboard navigation to go up and down in a modal. That might be kind of weird, but this pattern is going to allow us to do that because we've already wired up the escape key. We've made all this stuff optional. We can turn it off granularly, individually by feature, and I think that's going to work really well. So feel free to play around with different scenarios, different configurations, and hopefully this will work out well for you. And I think it's a good demonstration as to how a keyboard listener can really enhance the usability of a web interaction component that you may be building.